Again, my name is Casey Stevens, and I'm the Director of Trust Services at Midwest Special Needs Trust. We were established in 1989 by state statute. This makes us very, very unique in the special needs trust world. What this means is that state law allows for my organization to administer special needs trusts. And within that law, Missouri Medicaid is required to exempt the assets in the trust. So we not only are authorized in state law, but Medicaid is required by state law to exempt our trusts. As we heard earlier, special needs trusts are established for the sole benefit of the beneficiary who has a disability. We serve Missouri and all of the surrounding states, and we're what's called a pooled trust organization. So Midwest Special Needs Trust is a pooled trust organization. We learned about first party trusts and third party trusts. We're a third option in that we administer both first party and third party trusts. We serve as trustee, and we can go through all of that at the end of our time here today. I wanted to jump in and go to the next slide and talk just a little bit about what a special needs trust is. We learned a little bit earlier, but it is essentially a financial planning tool utilized for supplemental needs, not basic support. Later in this presentation, I do have a couple of slides about what a trust can be used for and what it cannot be used for. It is a written document. We can't go into a handshake and agree to have a special needs trust. It's a written document, and it is administered in accordance with applicable federal law, state law, Social Security policy, Medicaid policy, HUD policy, and all of the surrounding rules that go with those programs. It is considered an exempt asset for SSI, which is Supplemental Security Income, Medicaid, food stamps, and HUD housing. So special needs trust in general is considered an exempt asset. As we learned, that's the resource part that we're looking at. So it's considered an exempt resource for SSI, Medicaid, food stamps, and HUD housing. Attorneys, banks, and pooled trusts are all options for special needs trusts. We are going to look into the pooled trust option here. So on the next slide, I talk a little bit about what a pooled trust is. It's established by a nonprofit organization with individual beneficiaries joining the pool. So what that means is I have a trust. It's been approved by the Social Security Administration. It's required to be exempt for Medicaid, and that's my master trust agreement. And then the individuals with disabilities who want to use Midwest Special Needs Trust Services, they sign into what's called a joinder agreement and join the pool. So funds are pooled together for investment and management purposes, but accounting is kept separate. So we can always account for the amount of money that somebody has in their trust sub-account. We call them trust sub-accounts because they're underneath the master pool. Special needs trust with us, so a pooled trust, is typically lower cost. We learned that writing a special needs trust is anywhere between $1,500 and up, right? I would almost estimate that that's kind of low with some of the other attorneys I've worked with in the past. We're $500 to start a special needs trust, and our enrollment fee is $750. We also have a significantly lower option as well, which we'll also get into. So if $1,500 to write a special needs trust is not feasible for you, Midwest Special Needs Trust has a different option and a lower cost option. The thing with the pooled trust, as authorized by federal law, is at the end of the trust, so when the beneficiary passes away, Midwest Special Needs Trust can retain a portion of the funds for our charitable trust program. I'm not going to talk about our charitable trust program. I'm happy to answer any questions. or you can send me an email. But essentially, we use our charitable trust to help others with disabilities for items and services they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford. So pooled trusts are an organization that is serving as trustee. So instead of mom and dad or sister Marcy or cousin Johnny serving as trustee, Midwest Special Needs Trust serves as trustee, and the documents allow for a co-trustee to be appointed and serve with us. So there are three types that I'm going to talk about, the three types of special needs trust. So on the next slide, I just have three circular kind of graphic that says first party. So we learned first party are the trusts that are funded with the beneficiary's own funds. They received those funds, whether it was from an unplanned inheritance. Maybe they received a Social Security back pay. Maybe they are trying to qualify for SSI and Medicaid, but they have saved too many funds. Those are conserved funds. Maybe they received a personal injury settlement. All of those are first party funds. Those are the beneficiary's own funds. And we're going to talk more about this. Third party trust is somebody else's funds for the benefit of the beneficiary. We learned how important those were. And then an inactive trust is an option here at Midwest Special Needs Trust that provides parents some comfort in answering the question, what will happen when I'm gone? They can set up an inactive trust with us, and it's not funded until their death. So on the next slide, I go into a little bit more detail about what a first party trust is. So an individual with a disability, established by the individual with a disability, parents, grandparents, guardian, or the court with the beneficiary's assets. And I know we had the question about disability, so I want to touch on that. A special needs trust is set up for individuals with disabilities. That is their purpose, to protect the public benefits. And by disability, what we're really looking at and what the law is really going for is those who meet the definition of a Social Security disability. So not just those with developmental or intellectual, but also physical, mental health, and any combination of those. So if you can meet if they can meet the definition of Social Security's definition of of disability, sorry about that, they should qualify for a special needs trust. They should be able to have a special needs trust. Social Security does not require you to have a disability to have a special needs trust. What they're looking at is once you apply for Social Security benefits, then they want to know that your special needs trust is properly written and administered correctly. Midwest Special Needs Trust doesn't require you to have a disability, but we want you to either meet the definition by Social Security or be receiving services of any kind for us to be able to determine that a disability, that you have a disability or they have a disability. The next slide talks just a little bit more about first parties. Typical sources of funds are Social Security back payments. Somebody may work, or families may work really hard to get that Social Security, and we're denied. And finally, Social Security says, oh, here you go. Yep, you're considered disabled as of 4 years ago. And we're going to send you this huge back payment for all of those payments. Wonderful, except it only counts as an exempt resource for 9 months. And now you've got to figure out what to do with it because you need to qualify for Medicaid as well. So you can put that Social Security back pay into a first party special needs trust. Unplanned inheritances, grandma and grandpa did not know. They shouldn't have left. I'm going to use Joey. I normally use Johnny. So I'm going to use Joey as my example. They didn't know they should have planned for Joey, and they left him some money. And now what do? Joey needs to receive his SSI. He needs to receive those important Medicaid benefits. He can put those in a special needs trust. A lawsuit or settlement. Quite a few special needs trusts are funded with personal injury settlements, wrongful death settlements, all of those. And a very sad way, they are able to pay for items or services that they can't normally afford with their SSI because those funds are in a special needs trust. As we also learned, a first party trust that is funded with the beneficiary's own funds does have a Medicaid payback requirement. Medicaid says you can have these funds during your lifetime for as long as you need them. But when you pass away or the trust closes for any other reason, they are placing a lien on the remainder balance in the trust for the services they provided during your lifetime. So Medicaid says you can have this, but when you pass away, it's ours up to the amount that we paid during your lifetime. So that's with the first party trust, beneficiary funds it, it's irrevocable, but it also requires a Medicaid payback provision. On the next slide, we talk about third party. So we're going to switch over to third party. So this is established by somebody other than the beneficiary with their assets. So donor assets, these can be revocable or irrevocable. And typical sources of funds include, so on the next slide, I talked just a little bit about what a typical source of fund is. Personal funds, life insurance policies, wills, anything that is somebody else's funds can be left to the beneficiary and a third party. The nice thing about this is that there's no Medicaid payback. It wasn't the beneficiary's money, so Medicaid doesn't get to claim it. And then upon the beneficiary's death, because there's no Medicaid payback, assets are distributed per the donor's wishes. So the donor can then leave it to whomever they want at that point. And I've made distributions to nonprofits, to colleges, to symphonies, even to family members, whomever the donor says, that's who I will send a check to at the end of the trust sub account. On the next slide, and I think these are really important, are my inactive trusts. And they are established by the donor, parents, grandparents, other family members, whomever wants to give to an inactive trust can. And it's usually funded with the donor's assets at the donor's death. So this is typically life insurance policies or other trusts, family trusts, revocable trusts can all fund a special needs trust and inactive. And so it remains inactive until until a deposit is over our minimum balance, and our minimum balance is $500. So a family can come together, they can plan for Joey. They can all say, we're going to leave it to the special needs trust. And when that deposit that comes in that's over $500, we'll make it active and it's available for Joey's needs. Right now, to establish an inactive trust is $200, and then there's no other fees associated with it until it becomes active. It is a very, very good way for families to plan for their loved ones. In a very low cost option way for them to plan for their loved ones. The paperwork sits with me. We take care of everything. We serve as trustee. You might hear from us every once in a while just to make sure all the information is updated. But really, it's just a nice, comforting option that's out there for families to be able to plan for their loved ones before their death. And usually we see this in life insurance or other kind of family trusts. As we're going to switch gears a little bit. So I've talked about our first party, our third party, and our inactive options. And we've learned what a special needs trust is, why they're so important, why we should be planning for our loved ones, but no one has talked about how we can use it, right? So my next slide goes into a little bit about how we can use a special needs trust. At MS&T, it's as simple as submitting a request for funds form and the supporting documentation. It takes about 10 days. By the time we receive it, to the time they get a check in the mail, it is 10 days. I can't control the post office. And so once it leaves my office, I have to give the post office a generous amount of days to get it to the mail, to the recipient. But, so it's a pretty simple procedure here. The next slide, it does say who knows what is considered an allowable distribution. If we were in person, I'd be walking around the room, I'd have waving my hands around and calling on folks. But we're going to skip right to that allowable distributions. So I first want to talk about medical, dental, rehab, therapy, supplemental or support services. Medicaid is wonderful in so many ways, except it does not cover dental expenses very well. And for when I started 20 years ago, it didn't cover dental at all. And so uh, dental is huge. I pay a lot of dental bills, and it's so important. Home modifications, so ramps, widening doorways. Um, oh, my watch was talking to me. Sorry. Widening doorways. We've lowered cabinets. We have changed out flooring. So home modifications, clothing's an allowable expense from a trust, and it's always needed. Everybody needs a pair of PJs. My next slide talks a little bit more. So we have internet, cable, phone services, all allowable expenses. Education, camps, entertainment, classes, all of those are allowable expenses, as well as transportation and travel. A vehicle is an allowable expense as well. And I do want to talk just a few seconds about irrevocable prepaid burial policies. It is incredibly important that if you don't have one or you haven't considered purchasing a irrevocable prepaid burial policy, to do so, because, and especially important in a special needs trust, we cannot pay for the funeral after the death of the beneficiary. So I have this conversation on a regular basis with co-trustees that I've worked with for years and years and years, and I have to tell them, no, I can't pay for the funeral expenses. It's not allowed per the Social Security, and so we are not allowed to make that distribution. I highly recommend the purchase of an irrevocable prepaid burial policy. There is no upper limit in Missouri. You can have a burial policy for as much as you want, as long as it's irrevocable. On my next slide, so we've talked about all the things we can't cover, and that list is not comprehensive. I pay for a lot of vet bills and all of those things. Some of the things not allowable, and this is a really big not allowable, it's cash or payment to the beneficiary. That counts as income. So we learned that if the more income a beneficiary has, they may lose their SSI, right? So I can't make payments to the beneficiary. I also can't pay their rent or mortgage, their room and board at a residential care facility, or a skilled nursing facility. So rent, mortgage, and room and board are not allowable expenses. Social Security says you get $943 a month. That is to cover your rent and food. Okay. And so if somebody else pays those for you, then there could be a reduction in that SSI benefit. I also can't do charitable donations or gifts to others. Special needs trusts are for the sole benefit of the beneficiary. So charitable contributions before the death of the beneficiary with a pooled trust, or buying Christmas gifts for all of the staff, is not an allowable expense. And then basic utilities. So we learned I can cover cable, internet, and phone. Those are not considered required utilities like electric, gas, sewer, trash, and water. So I can't pay the utility bills as well. On the next slide, there's a couple of others that we can't pay for. So no food items, no explosive firearms or weapons, though I do see a request for it every once in a while. We can't go gambling, and no alcohol, and no payment after the death of the beneficiary. So it's important to remember that it is for the supplemental needs of the beneficiary. So sole benefit and supplemental needs. Those are the things that are more likely going to be approved. And so I just want to, I know that Mr. Chiodini has lots of good things to say, and I want to be able to answer some questions here. But just to, if anybody has or wants to email us, that is my contact information. If you've seen me present over the years, this is a much shorter presentation than what I've done in the past, and it leaves lots of room for the conversations or questions that folks have.
The one about the depression. So, and it looks like really it's anything that my understanding is anything that qualifies for SSI or SSDI, they can do the special needs trust. So, and yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. So I hope that answers that question, for that individual. So yeah, if they qualify for SSDI or SSI, they should be able to do the special needs trust. There's one about, just asking about the percentage that your organization
Oh,
does for the
yeah,
donation.
25%.
Okay.
If you're looking at other, so if you're a family that does their research and you're looking into the pool trust option, you will find that other pool trust organizations retain 100%, or
Mhm.
maybe they retain 50%. So we're at 25%.
And the remaining value just does go to the family then, or, okay.
If it's a first party, it goes back to Medicaid. And if
Mhm.
it's a third party, it goes to whomever the donor said for it to go to in the trust agreement documents.
Okay. There's one specifically about third-party trust. Does a third-party trust have to be irrevocable from the beginning? No.
No. So if the donor is living, it can be revocable. There are some tax consequences, or tax implications, let's say consequences, implications to it both being irrevocable and revocable.
This may be on your website, which thank you for having that on the screen. But if you
Yeah.
wanted to just a little bit, give a little bit more about the process for Midwest Special Needs Trust, what would they need to know, have ready for in advance, next step after they call?
Yeah, so good question. If you call and you say, I heard Casey talk the other day, you're gonna get directed to Miss Shelley. Shelley does all of our openings, and she is gonna ask just a few questions. Tell me a little bit about your loved one. She's gonna confirm where you all live, what the age of the beneficiary or the age of your loved one is, and then kind of what you're wanting to use the special needs trust for. She's going to explain some of our processes here to make sure we're a good fit for you. And then she's going to mail you or email you documents for you to look over and complete. It's no attorney is required to complete our documents. However, we always advise that if you want an attorney, you're more than welcome to have one. If you do get an advisor, they do need to sign off saying that they advised on this. And then you would submit those back to Shelley. She'll look over them, a few more conversations, usually just one. And we would proceed with opening at that point. So we can do this pretty quickly within a week. If it's like one of those, we have to get it done. We can do it. But usually our average opening is about 2 weeks by the time the documents go out and come back and questions are answered. So pretty quickly, because our documents are already written, that makes the process a lot faster than other options.
So we have one. Oh, here's one. Yeah, it does say you specifically. Casey, how do these types of trusts work if Joey moves out of the state of Missouri?
So we are able to administer the trust for the beneficiary wherever they live. That's not always the case with pool trust organizations. Some are limited to the state, but we have beneficiaries who've lived in Australia, they live in China, they live in New York. So we're able to administer wherever they are.
And then there's just several other ones just about different things about what special needs trusts can pay for. Property taxes, rent and utilities are not allowed. Home condos, can they pay for vacations, food and shelter, but also entertainment? I don't know if you have any kind of advice on that, or if Joshua or anybody
I
wants to jump
I
in.
do. Yeah,
Mhm.
I can jump in on what
That's great.
is allowable. So vacations are absolutely allowable. We can pay for the beneficiary and their companion, and we can pay for all expenses for both, including food expenses.
Mhm.
So if there's sufficient funds, I'm getting ready to send somebody to Disney, which is a very expensive trip, right? And so we are paying for him to go and his companion to go, and they are going to love a week at the resort. So absolutely allowable. We pay, there are companies that pay for vacation that do vacations. They go to Branson quite a bit. We pay for those. We do a lot of cruises. So
Mhm.
yeah, all
Yeah,
of that's allowable.
so there was property taxes on there, and then two people did ask about like rent, like if rent is beyond what, you know, SSI will pay for, or, you know, if rent and utilities are not allowed,
Yeah.
only for an inactive trust or all special needs trusts?
So rent is, you are gonna find some trustees or some advocates in the special needs trust world that are gonna pay for rent. And there will be a reduction in their SSI benefits, and that's fine. It is not something that we do at our organization. If that's something that you want done, then we may not be the right fit, though I think we can still have a conversation about it. Um, Property taxes are allowable. Real estate taxes are not, but I make an exception to pay them. So difference between the type of taxes. And then utilities go along with rent. So you're gonna find some administrators and some special needs trust folks that are gonna pay for utilities. I'm not. And so again, if that's something that you want paid, then we're not going to. Now, if there's a difference in the amount of rent that they're being charged and the amount of income they're receiving, I will pay that difference. So typically I see that with residential cares or skilled nursing facilities, I'll pay a private room differential. Though I have seen it maybe once or twice just in like the individual rent kind of world where for some reason their rent, the renter is charging them 1,000, but they only get their 943. I'll pay that little bit of difference. So yes.
Yeah, the only thing I mean, 100% correct. All I'll add to that is like with the third party trust, if public benefits only pays so much, you can pay the excess, like
The
Casey
difference.
said, with the
Yeah.
trust money. What you may have to worry about is SSI may impute income to you, which would lessen the amount of SSI you receive.
Right. And you can do it through a first party as well. And there are pooled trust administrators and other pooled trust and other special needs trust folks that are going to tell you it's better to pay the rent and have the reduction than for them to, and we're just not going to do that. Our rule is no, we don't pay for rent. But we can talk about those things when you call as well.
There's a couple more I'd love to go ahead and get answered.
Yeah.
So one says, are the not allowables only not allowed due to the person being on SSI versus the SSDI, but not SSI? Is this list also the rule? So they're comparing the SSDI and the SSI, and
I love that question. And I could like talk all day about the administration of between two benefits. Yes, technically those not allowable are for SSI recipients. Again, though, at Midwest Special Needs Trust, we apply the rule across for simplification of administration. We'll make an exception dependent on benefits. What you'll see though in other states is when Medicaid and SSI go hand in hand, we still can't do that. Here in Missouri, it's not applicable. That's not something that I have to say. So, but yeah, absolutely wonderful question. I love it. Yeah.
Okay, there's just a couple more. Is can you hold a home / condo, etc. in a special needs trust? If not, how are these typically handled? We talked a little bit just about, you know, giving the person owning the home versus the trustee and all of that, but we can talk a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, in general, yes, a special needs trust can hold a home in trust. It's not something that we do at our organization. I'm just going to be upfront and honest. And you're going to be hard pressed probably to find a trustee that wants to hold a home. Property is difficult to manage on a lot of ends. So it's not highly recommended on my end, though. Joshua may have a different story. I could kind of tell that you were along the same lines of it's already an exempt asset. And
you certainly wouldn't like transfer your home that you're living in to your child's special needs trust.
Right.
It would only go in there like when you pass away as an inheritance to the kid, you leave it to Joey so that way he has a place to live and he could then sell it, and then the proceeds fund the special needs trust with cash.
There's other things I always like to have the conversation of, can Joey live in the home? Sorry about that.
Right.
Can Joey live in the home
independently?
Can he maintain a home? Can his trust Right. Can they sustain the cost of the maintenance? Can they
Right.
sustain the cost of insurance? And so it's not just we want to leave our home in trust to Joey. It's where's Joey going to be in 10 years? And now you have a trustee with a hard decision to say, I'm going to pull the trust or I'm going to pull the home and pull you out of your home and liquidate it. And no trustee wants to do that. So,
But if-
yes,
right.
technically.
Yeah, but if the idea is to leave the home to the trust, knowing that the trustee is going to sell it, so that way there's extra liquidity in the trust. We do
Right.
that all the time.
Yeah.
But as Casey said, if your child does not have the ability to live independently, it really becomes almost a burden
Mhm.
for the administration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there
we-
is a reason I'm not a property manager and hold homes in trust. I will
Yeah,
tell
and
you.
I will
I've done
say-
it one other time.
We get this question a lot with our, we have a caregivers group that meets once a month, that is for older adults. The caregivers are older adults, so their children, their loved ones are also older adults as well, and that's one of their biggest questions is, again, where are they going to live afterwards? And they're always like, well, I could leave them my home, or maybe I could buy them a home, or something like that. And then we do always talk about, can they maintain a home? Can they pay their bills? Can they, do these kinds of things? And
Right.
then we kind of flesh that out, and that all kind of starts to make more sense. So I'm glad that you all are kind of thinking that way, and preparing them for that as well. So